Hi guys, hello there. This is a podcast, so no pictures. So the purpose of this is to have a look and see how the elites or the globalists or whatever you want to call them might be thinking of using this crisis to kind of foreshadow or to get laws in place that will be useful to them in pursuing other agendas. And I'll just be doing a little bit of recap of some interesting points to note. I know a lot of you have been talking about how, it escaped from the laboratory and 5G. I'm totally open-minded about all that. In fact, I have it on good authority from someone in Hong Kong that the word on the grapevine in Hong Kong, in fact, the commonly shared belief is that this was nothing to do with the food market. It did escape or was released from the biolab in Wuhan. And I think that most of us are on the same page. But where a lot of us differ is some people are saying, well, it's just a normal flu. It's a big hoax, the media blowing it out of proportion, it's all problem, reaction, solution. Yeah, that could be. Other people are getting panicked, doing panic buying. In fact, at Tesco last night at about 11:45 at night, there was someone actually there with a mask. So people are taking it seriously. But whichever side of the camp you're on, I think we all have to acknowledge that the governments and the press are running with us, and they are all treating it as a major something right now. And so we have to look at that rather than having our differences about, well, if it's serious, if it's not. I think in terms of people who say it's just a normal flu and that, well, that remains to be seen. It seems the R0, which is the ability of people to spread it, is pretty high. Also, there's this thing where when you get it again, you can get it more seriously and it can damage your heart. You can have heart attacks. It seems that having it the first time almost enables a pathway for you to get it worse the second time rather than developing an immunity to it in the second time, which seems rather different. Then there's the case of sometimes people are getting better. They think they're getting over it. Then suddenly they get worse. People have been talking about how 5G can make it worse through the way it affects oxygen and the electrons in oxygen in your body. Also, how it's different from colds and flu is you are infectious before you have symptoms, and people stay asymptomatic for a very long time, which of course facilitates the spread of it because people are going around thinking there's nothing wrong. It also has such a long incubation period. That makes it hard to tell as well with the numbers what the death rate's going to be, because the death's only showing up much later. For example, Spain today announced a death, but the death actually happened around the 13th of February, and they've only just decided to classify it as a coronavirus death because they did the autopsy. So you don't really know. Unfortunately, it's quite a long, painful death, and so numbers that are showing up now may reflect in deaths a month later. So we can't really be sure how that works. I just find it amusing. The best advice they can give us is wash our hands. The authorities must think that people in Italy and China never wash their hands, because apparently washing your hands cures you of everything. So don't worry, guys. You can smoke, drink, take drugs, but as long as you wash your hands. But in fact, I think at the moment taking a cruise ship is probably more hazardous to your health than taking drugs, because there's another possible outbreak on a cruise ship that was traveling between San Francisco and Mexico. Someone in Santa Clara County, San Francisco, has passed away. They contracted it. Well, I don't know if they contracted it on the ship, but they certainly were on the ship. So let's get to thinking what this could mean. They're talking today, both in the States and here in the papers, what's going to happen with people in the gig economy, or who are self-employed, or who work for small companies if they have to take time off due to having this virus or to self-quarantining. So it's a really big problem. I think even the biggest companies, if they have a lot of staff having to take leave due to self-quarantine or looking after sick children or sick relatives or any of the above, it's going to have a major impact on productivity and the economy, but more importantly onto people's own pockets. I mean, if you run a small business, you might just be on the break-even point. You might not be able to afford to pay staff to have time off due to quarantine. And what this opens so brilliantly is the possibility for governments to say, well, wouldn't it be great if we had a universal income? Now, universal income, it's part of Agenda 21. It's part of the kind of communist Marxist push of leftists. It's very progressive. It's already been tried, and you've heard me discuss it before, but wouldn't this be a wonderful time to push the benefits of that? So just to recap, universal income is where everyone in the country, regardless of income, age, whatever, gets a set amount, say maybe £700 or $800 per month. And the way, for rich people, it's recouped back from your tax return, but if you're on the breadline, obviously you've got the money. So it gets past the need for people to apply for benefits. And of course, in a situation like this, it can be quite useful because you know that regardless of your income, if you're self-employed, if you're in the gig economy, however you work, you know you're going to have that £700 at the end of the month, or whatever the nominal value is, regardless. So it enables you to take time off work in a crisis like this. So I just see this crisis would be a wonderful selling point for universal income, which I think they'd kind of like to bring in anyway, because it's great with the advent of AI, and it might have to with all the people out of work due to AI. It might be great. I think it's also a big civil rights grab. I saw in the Daily Mail that 75% of people are quite open to the idea of whole cities being quarantined. And imagine, once that's happened, once we've had that level of martial law where people have got used to the idea that you can shut a whole town down, tell people, close schools, close universities, as they are now doing in Italy, or seal people into apartment blocks like they're doing in China and Wuhan. If you get people used to that idea, when might they use it again? What if they start to panic us about carbon and they tell us, well, this week carbon levels are going to go over a dangerous threshold. We need to quarantine everybody to stop you going out so that we can keep that carbon below a certain level. You know, how could they use this in future? Create more scare stories in order to quarantine people, limit travel. You can see how people have changed their travel habits. I mean, Italy's deserted, tourism down, many fewer flights taking place across the States, where all airlines are experiencing a massive drop in demand. It just shows how pandemics can affect demand, and that's exactly what they want. Of course, there's the obvious thing about a global pandemic means a global response, means much greater powers for individual governments, and also the big overarching intergovernmental structures like the WHO, World Bank, etc., etc. I think this also could be, we've always talked on my channel about the battle between communism and capitalism and how we're reaching a peak in that. Well, I think this is pretty good for the people on the communist sides, because a pandemic like that needs a lot more government, more state involvement, more nanny state, more government involved monetarily, fiscally, government stepping in to mess with interest rates, to offer support to people, to offer, in America, isn't this a great advert for saying why we need Medicaid? Because you have so many people uninsured who can't afford to have the test or to have the treatment. You see, it really feeds into a lot of communist narratives about why you would need more government, bigger government, more government intervention, and more government giving state aid to industries or individual businesses to keep them going. Everything about this just cries out for government spending and government involvement, and it is a massive threat to capitalism. Now, what a lot of people are saying is China would not shut down their whole economy like they have for nothing, right? So why I entitled this Scorched Earth policy? It's not really that. I've just used the word because it kind of encapsulates it. But what if China have shut everything down as a kind of predatory pricing? China think their economy is big enough and everyone's reliant enough on them for them to be able to easily get things going again. So, for example, Apple are talking about moving some of their production away from China so that they would not be as affected by a future problem in China. But they are only able at maximum in the foreseeable future to move 4% of their production away from China. They are totally reliant on China. As of pharmaceuticals, the motoring industry, if China shut down, they are going to shut down and cause recession in the world economy. I don't even think we're beginning to see the knock-on effects yet of what the shutdown in China production has done to the world economy. What if they're looking almost, when you've got a big company and they do predatory pricing where they can afford to take a hit, to take losses in the short run because they're so big by putting their prices really low. So they put their prices really low, drive everyone else out of business. They survive because they're so big, and then they're able to scoop up the rest of the market when the pricing war is over, kind of thing. I wonder if China aren't maybe using this mentality almost to tip the West into recession to gain a competitive advantage, especially as with Trump, they weren't doing so hot on the trade war. So I'm not really saying that they released this with the intention of doing that, but hey, why let a good crisis go to waste? Maybe they decided to capitalize on the opportunity. Who knows? Now, Chris on Peak Prosperity, and I'll leave the link because he did an excellent analysis. He showed some graphs which show how activity in Chinese, both in manufacturing and in terms of their transport networks, usually dips during their New Year or their spring break festival. Then it climbs steadily again back to sort of peak levels and they really get going. So this year, activity that's in their manufacturing, in their industries, in terms of their transport networks, dropped due to the spring break and New Year holiday, and it hasn't recovered. And even though the numbers seem to generate, and I'm not saying that I believe the China numbers, but even though their numbers seem to show that they are getting control of the coronavirus and experiencing virtually no cases, or just maybe 1 or 2 cases in the rest of China out of Hubei, their production hasn't started again. People haven't started flying again, traveling again, using cars again. Industry hasn't geared up again. Why? If they've really got it under control, why is everything not gearing up, or at least on the upward trajectory? It seems to be flatlining. So I do think this is going to have a huge knock-on. We were already teetering on the brink of recession. Once these shortages start kicking in, and I mean there's supplies for everything from chemicals, motoring, pharmaceuticals, it's really going to bite in the rest of the world and push us into recession and put capitalism as a whole under threat. Is that not a communist's dream? I mean, even the Democrats are thinking about how wonderful a recession would be because it might get rid of Trump. You can see people, progressive leftists out there, might think this is just the perfect way to kill off capitalism and convince everybody that the only way to cope with both the green crisis and pandemics like this is by having world government, much more state control, much more centralized planning, and a communist regime. I mean, I'm sure they're already pointing to China and saying, well, look how well they've got it under control. That's the way to go. So you can see that there are a lot of agendas in the world that can be advanced by using this crisis. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of worrying, you know. So, I mean, the solution for this whole thing, whether they caused it, whether they didn't, whether it's going to be huge, whether it's not going to be huge. I mean, basically, it is huge now because it's everywhere in the press. It's all people are talking about. So even if it fizzles out tomorrow, it's still going to have a dramatic effect on the economy because of the lockdown in China. So it's going to affect all our lives, whether we catch it or not, whether we think it's a big deal or not. Just to say, the impact on tourism, that's going to cause a lot of countries a big hit. Possible school closures. I mean, Italy are closing schools and universities. Although I think that one may shoot the globalists in the foot, because the less people are in school, the less they can be indoctrinated, isn't that so? So it might be a good thing that kids are out of school, getting more influence from their parents instead of their left-wing teachers. And if you think about it, every time someone goes into a surgery and or passes it on to a healthcare worker, you've got to close down the whole surgery for deep cleaning. Every time there's a suspected case at a school, you've got to close down the whole school for deep cleaning. Imagine the loss of productivity, the loss of education hours, the loss of capacity in our medical medical facilities, from surgeries to hospitals, because they're having to be closed down all the time because, you know, there's been a person with coronavirus. What about the fact that a lot of medical health people and teachers seem to be getting this? It's just going to cause a problem within the private sector massively and the public sector. I mean, we hear now of people in the army. I heard there might be a case in the Pentagon today. There are firefighters up in Seattle. I think there's up to 15 firefighters quarantined. It's affecting all public services. I think we're going to see public services be driven down to the barest minimum because of the first responders in many cases being affected like this. I mean, this coronavirus is just sucking resources away from where they really need to be. I hear El Al has laid off 1,000 workers because of lack of demand in the transport industry. And yeah, so it's quite a lot going on. And I mean, I've got to say to you guys, I mean, what's going on with Boris? You know, this summer he's got massive negotiations with the EU, trade negotiations. They've got the escalating crisis in Syria, and of course this pandemic. And what's he doing? He's talking about paternity leave. I mean, I just wonder if this guy needs a little tune-up and maybe to have his points adjusted, because he doesn't seem to be, you know, grasping that there's quite a lot of grave things, and this is not the time to be changing diapers or nappies or anything. So I just wanted to touch on those issues. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm not going to do an update on all the numbers. I know that in the Scandinavian countries it's heading up. We've had more cases in Chile, quite a lot in Ecuador. Even in little San Marino, we're up to about 13 cases. So in many countries now it's taking off. I believe that Egypt have got a lot more than the one they're acknowledging, because they seem to be exporting a large number of cases to places like Canada and Australia. Oh, just to say briefly, a lot of people have said, will it go away in the summer? But when we look at Australia, we'll have to keep a close eye on Australia as an indication of that. And also, I mean, Singapore and Malaysia, Thailand, all those countries were pretty steady on the numbers, but they're tending to go up there. Although the recovery rate is high and they've had very few deaths, but is it really an advantage to be in a hot country if you're living in air conditioning all the time with a sort of temperatures below 20 and it's kind of away from the sunlight? So I'm not quite sure that's really thought through. And there's question mark. Apparently Rodney Adams from the infection control at Aga Khan University in Nairobi, he said there's no indication that climate affects transmission. We'll have to see when it heads to summer. I mean, I saw Mike Pence saying that there's not a general threat to Americans and it's kind of under control and will really only affect people with underlying conditions and older people. But here in this country, they're talking about 80% of people getting it and 10% of people landing up in hospital. So they're not really on the same page there, are they? I think America's really behind the curve. But just to say at the end, a lot of people are saying, well, it's not so serious. It's a tiny, minuscule proportion of people that are sick and dying in the entire world. And yes, I agree with that. But I will say straw, camel, back. Because this may be a straw, but sometimes a straw is all that's needed to break the back of the NHS. Because I think that even 100 deaths or 1,000 cases of this would take up so much capacity, maybe cause so many closures, so much cancelling of other operations, so much of a diversion of important skills, that it will have an important effect, even if it's just a straw. So I don't think it's important that it's such a small amount of people, because a small amount of people, small amount of people is all you need, maybe, to break the camel's back of things like the NHS or the economy.